I don't know if you followed all of the stuff, but we did a big international collaboration in 2018 about the murders of UN experts in Congo, a Swedish and an American UN expert that was murdered very brutally in the south of Congo. And it became a big investigation, a big story. We eventually won an Emmy Award for it. It really changed some of the ways of the investigation of who was behind the murder, and it was called Deceptive Diplomacy and the cover-up by the UN. So now, more than 5 years later, trials and the judicial process is coming to an end, and early next year, and we found out the date of that. So we have to kind of see what's if we're going to do a follow-up.
Okay.
And what will happen when the verdict comes. So that was like an urgent matter that we had to take care of.
Is this one of those collaborative stories that you're doing, like with Putin's, what's it called, Secret War, that you did with the other Scandinavian national broadcasters? Is this story also collaborative?
So in one way, we are my team in Stockholm. Most of the department that I work with is in Gothenburg for the Swedish television, but the team that I work with is located in Stockholm, and we are kind of the international task force in the SVT, working together with partners all around the world in these kind of big collaborations that became very famous around the Panama Papers, which I wasn't part of that, but then I started with a lot of money laundering, corruption investigations, and the Saida project with the Swedish woman that was murdered in Congo. Her name was Saida. Was my really first big international cooperation with Le Monde and Radio France and Süddeutsche Zeitung and there. And then we've gone on and cooperated with like all the big media partners. So yeah, it's one of those investigations where we really need to be cross-border, and because the problem that we're tackling or investigating is cross-border. And that has been kind of the revolution of journalism over the last 10 years, to go from a perspective of we're competing against everybody to like a concept of radical sharing, where we can be hundreds of journalists from 50 countries sharing material and working together to bring a topic up on the agenda.
Is that because the economics of your industry have changed? You're not necessarily competing for the story, for the breaking.
I think it's a matter of globalization, kind of like one of the founder of these. There are different international networks that we're a part of, like ICIJ, International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and OCRP, Organized Crime and Corruption Project, and others. And I think one of the founders have said that, to cross-border organized crime and corruption, you need to be a cross-border network, because the money is flowing, when it comes to money laundering stories, through 50 different jurisdictions. So if you're only Swedish, you will not be able to swim through that. But if you have partners all around the world, you can be very successful in getting the information so fast. And I think what have showed is that in the globalized world, where criminals, corrupt politicians, or companies or whatever, they work all over the world super fast, and authorities have still been in their national state kind of mind, even with Europe or the EU and everything. So journalists have gone ahead a lot when it comes to international crime and corruption and money laundering, because we have been able to cooperate. So with the Swedbank investigation, for example, we had amazing help from our colleagues in Ukraine, where without them we couldn't have show that the corrupt money that was stolen from the Ukraine state went through Swedbank and then ended up in the pockets of Trump's campaign manager.
Yeah, Paul Manafort. How deep that rabbit hole goes is actually amazing. Do you feel like this is a career story for you?
I think you could see it in one way, like, why couldn't I let the Swedbank story go 5 years ago and just move on, and instead writing a book for 5 years about it? I guess that could be a way of saying that, I'm just trying to hold on to this mega story. But I see it as first of all, it has helped us incredibly with doing other stories as well, because it gained us a reputation of being very thorough and very sophisticated, I would say, because it was a very complex investigation. And we impressed a lot of people inside the banking world that saw what we did and that know the business from the inside. And I think they would maybe say, journalists are a little populistic, they don't understand, they are shallow, etc. And they saw our investigation and they saw that we did good work. So that helped us to do amazing stories afterwards. But I mean, what really is, it is a career story in the sense, I would put it in the ways of saying, like, it is the story of my life so far, in the sense it's the story of all Europeans so far in the 21st century, because it's the story about how Europe changed during the last 30 years of what happened in Europe after the fall of the wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. What is the story of the post-Soviet, post-Cold War era? And now it's a pretty good time to summarize. Like, okay, now we have Trump is just getting into power again. We can look back on 35 years of kind of liberal democracy, European Union expansion, NATO expansion, the West trying to build a new world after the Cold War. And this is what we got. And it was nothing that people expected, and were very shattered and in a very problematic state. And I think if you follow the money that went through Swedbank, you will find the answer to why it happened.
That's a pretty long bow to draw, like that the story is that of Europe over the last 30 years. Are you referring to, you mentioned this in a previous interview you did, that money's not about money, but it's about power, it's about war, it's about empire. Is that the thematic you're referring to by saying it's the story of Europe over the last 30 years? Since it is a story about hidden money and opacity in the financial system?
Yeah, I think it's a sense, it's like other people have said it much better than me, but I think it's what interests me is that, if the kind of core of the Cold War was the nuclear bomb, that was the whole kind of what everything centered around, the balance of power, the terror balance, how we're going to act in this. I think the core of the post-Cold War is money.
Wow.
In the sense
that's a great way to frame it.
And it was a Russian, there's an amazing book that we've been inspired very much about. And she wrote the blurb on our front page, which we're very happy about, Catherine Belton, that wrote a book that called Putin's People. And it's like the ultimate account of the KGB state that have been built in Russia. And what one former top spy of the Russian security service says there is that money laundering is much more powerful than the atomic bomb, because we can use it every day to dismantle the Western system from the inside. And I think when you look at money laundering and money in that perspective, that is like, I think that is the core story that we've been trying to tell, that maybe 20 years ago, we saw Russian oligarchs buying football teams, buying super yachts, buying castles in France, buying beautiful women, buying power for themselves. Power and they're super rich.
Power and status.
And we saw that was the aim for the money, to become rich and to become on top of the food chain. And we saw money laundering many times as a victimless crime. Like, this is rich people trying to avoid taxes. This is rich people, da da da. And I think what we have done, not me personally, but the international collaboration with hundreds of journalists all around the world, is to try to tell a different story, which is money laundering has been the essential tool for organized crime, corruption, and corrupt criminal states to shatter Western democracy.
Right. So rather than it just being this system of offshore financial plumbing enables really wealthy people to maybe hide some taxes, or even you could make some really soft argument that it maybe encourages investment into other places which wouldn't have access to funds otherwise. But that same plumbing, that same system allows for the scale of these criminal organizations to one, be so large, but also to be so broad. So
yeah, and to be so effective in, like, there's so many ways of talking about this, and it can be very theoretical sometimes. So I think it's important to, it's easy to say all these things, but we have now a lot of examples of how concrete it is actually was. And Belton's book is one example of how people from the inside of Russia that left is telling their viewpoint and really saying that, this is a tool that we're using for geopolitical influence. But it's like, maybe 15 years ago, it was a discussion about offshore. Like, I know David Cameron and Obama put it up and saying, the offshore system is ruining the national state economies because we can't, tax people in the same way. People are hiding their money. We're losing income, revenues. And I think that is true also. So that has made the kind of welfare state, the Swedish model, very much harder, because if you can't...
You need taxable receipts to pay for.
If you people that, like in Sweden, we have this amazing tech revolution. We have a lot of billionaires now. We have an amazing economy from one point of view. But at the same time, it's like we're getting poorer and poorer in the terms of our identity as Swedish, because we feel like, okay, where is this money going? And I think there's one perspective. Like, we're not able to tax people as much as before, and we're not able to build a society in the same way. Mm-hmm. But much more dangerous is the fact that our institutions, and I'm talking not only Swedish, but European and American institutions, are being attacked and played with this dirty money. And they are, like, the Brexit campaign, for example, was funded with a lot of Russian black money. The US election 2000 very much influenced by Russia using the money that had been laundered through these Western banks. And they are called black funds. So the idea is that these oligarchs that flushes billions into the Western system, some of it goes to offshore for their own personal gain, like buying boats. Some of it goes to 50, 60, hundreds layers to these black funds that the Russian security service have access to, and that they can use when they want to donate money to the Brexit campaign. All of a sudden, there's a big South African donation, and everybody's like, oh, this is a South African businessman coming in with billions that want to have Brexit. And then you find out that there was a flow of Russian money, and then it was connected to the Russian embassy or whatever. And it's like, it is very clear now in the aftermath that this is the case. But when it was going on 10 years ago, started maybe with in the Brexit and the US election, it was conspiracy theories. It was no, this is too much. Like, Trump's campaign manager will be cooperating and funded by Russian oligarchs. That's, give me a break. Yeah. But it's true.
Yeah, but you showed in the work that you and your colleague, was it Joachim?
Yeah, Joachim.
That Paul Manafort had directly traced through Vega Holdings, I think it was. Mm-hmm. This huge sum of money that was paid by Yanukovych, who's one of the most put him on a pinboard type kleptocrats in Europe over the last 30 years.
Yeah, probably I think he's maybe on top of the list of the most corrupted president of all time in terms of the amount of money that he stole from the
tens
Ukraine.
Of billions of dollars.
Yeah, they say $30 billion was stolen from the Ukrainian state during his presidency. And he was a Swedbank client through a proxy. And I think to understand the conflict in Ukraine today and the war, I'm talking about the conflict and the war, you can see that those going in different. But it really started with Yanukovych being this Putin-allied president that when a big part of Ukraine wanted to turn to the West, to Europe, being part of a kind of our way, Viktor Yanukovych as president was influence operation by Putin to go the other direction. And, it was after he fled to Moscow in 2014, that's when Russia invaded Crimea, and the whole war that we have now really started.
I think it's such a compelling way you put it that the problem of this offshore plumbing or the money laundering isn't simply just a more shallow pool of taxable receipts for a government to then fund their, whether it's welfare economy or whatever their good state projects might look like. But it goes even further into an intentional dismantling of those individual countries within this broader European Union. Like, it's a very compelling way to frame it. Do you find that framing is sort of missing, and this is maybe a big part of the work you're trying to do, is to like open people's eyes up to this problem is way more devastating than simply a couple of rich guys getting a bit richer?
I guess there's many narratives when it comes to this, but one is, of course, that we have a political discussion that is very much about like individual responsibility, and we have this very important discussions about crime, immigration, or people with bad morals doing bad things or whatever. And at the same time, we have almost no discussions about what it really is damaging our society on a structural level, which is the system of under money, as it's called. It's this title of a very interesting book that came out in the US from a former hedge fund manager. Under money is the Japanese term for all these money that are flowing. Yeah, it's a Japanese term, I think, and it's kind of like blood money, under money, but it's money that flows. It's the system, the plumbing system, as you say, that is unofficial. And it really essentially works against democracy in so many ways, because organized crime, mafia needs it to function. Smuggled their cocaine from Colombia into Europe to have their trafficking boats, bribing officials in the ports, bribing politicians. Organized crime mafia needs it. But more, all these kind of state-connected actors needs it even more to be able to steal money from the public. You see Assad now, for example, he goes to Moscow or flees to Moscow, and he has all these
tens of billions as well.
Property in Russia that he built up to as a security, and it's a system of unaccountability that have been building up in the name of globalization, which has been very, very harming for all kind of progressive projects I think in the world, because it takes away power from the public and puts it in the hands of
extremely rich hidden donors and influence.
Yeah, and many times very crooked ones.
Right,
That's
exactly.
That's the thing, that these
morally opposed to what the society might be interested in.
Yeah, but take Russia, for example. It's like you can be morally angry at what happened in Russia in the 90s when the wars of the natural resources played out. But if you takes the Kissinger perspective, which is always to look like very without emotions on history,
Politik.
You see that, okay, so in Russia, if you wanted to be a billionaire in Russia in the 90s, you had to kill people. So the people that got billionaires in Russia in the 90s were the people that had the capacity or the morals to kill for money. And that was the way to survive. Like, if you were not in the game of killing, you could not be on top in Russia in the 90s. You would be killed yourself if you didn't protect yourself.
If you wanted to participate.
With the mafia. So these oligarchs that became successful, they were the ones that were okay with collaborating with the worst organized crime groups in the world. The people that cut the heads of their mothers. Like, the Russian mafia, which is maybe the most brutal in, history.
Really? Worse than the Mexicans now?
No, that's a good question, of course. But I think the brutality of the Russian mafia was started way before some of the worst that we have today. Like the culture that was grown up in the Russian prisons and the oligarchs cooperated with these people. Like Swedbank's biggest non-resident high-risk customer, his business partner was a leader of one of the biggest organized crime groups in Russia. And that specific leader fell out of an airplane in South Africa all of a sudden after a few years. Like this happened to many of these guys. So to be able to succeed in Russia in the 90s, you had to be a kind of a cruel person. And those are the same people now that have all this money. So you can't expect that they all of a sudden will be like, oh, let's build a nation of laws or whatever. They are grown up to murder for money.
Yeah.
This system, this offshore system, has made everything possible for them.
Allowed the scale of their influence.
Instead of stopping them or preventing them from gaining more power.
Right. So if you just look at the demand and supply problem for this issue. You and 100 of your colleagues have to spend years and years investigating into just one instance, which admittedly filters out into many instances, but it's a lot of resources, a lot of work, and you guys are, this side of the equation, and then the supply of the equation, the huge income for the legal firms and the accountants and the banks themselves. Like, as an incentives problem, does it feel kind of insurmountable? Like, what can actually be, how effective can you be in fixing the problems that you have identified specifically with the Swedbank example? So you know what I mean? Like, if you look at it as a demand supply issue, the supply really outstrips the demand here.
I think when it comes to change, like there was a lot of discussions in the UK, for example, about Londongrad, about House of Lords being infiltrated or influenced by Russian oligarchs, newspapers, British newspapers bought by British oligarchs or Russian oligarchs, football teams, institutions, parties.
All the big real estate.
All big real estate. So we were reporting on this Londongrad kleptocracy for many years. And when it really changed was when the invasion of Ukraine 2022 came. And that was when UK shut it down. Like, okay, we're taking the keys from Oligarchs and others. We're forcing Roman Abramovich to sell Chelsea. So what was needed was actually, bombings in Europe again, which is pretty. It's pretty tragic that had to be blood on the streets of Europe in Ukraine to make the change. Because the truth is that when it comes to in UK, for example, it's even though it's been bad from a progressive point of view that this money has been flowing, it has also been very good for some of the elites in the European countries. Like the City of London when you can argue that the UK's influence on world politics have declined and the status of the British Empire, as you know.
You could definitely make that argument.
So one of the things that made UK float still was that everybody want to invest in UK. And how did you attract that investment? Yeah, you gave them golden passports, you gave them access to the finest institutions, you let them hang out with the kings and queens, and a lot of people in England and UK became extremely rich as well. It was just that they had to sacrifice a lot of the things that they said that they were fighting for. So all these law firms, PR people, lawyers, politicians were intertwined in the plumbing system, and they were connected to it. They were tapped into it, and even if they wanted to, it was very hard for them to pull out. And I think Swedbank example is not as Sweden has not been that big of an interest for when it comes to the infiltration of the institutions, because the Russian oligarch doesn't want to live in Sweden. He wants to live his kids at Eton. He wants to shop at Harrods. He wants to, live by Hyde Park, not by Vasaparken here in Stockholm. But, the oligarch money that flowed through Swedbank was the majority of the profits of the bank that made a lot of stock owners in Sweden very happy during many years. So it was good for society. No, it was bad for society. It was bad for the world, but it was very good for people that wanted to.
A couple of individuals at Swedbank.
Not only a couple, but, Swedish pension funds.
Right.
Everything is that is so interesting. That is like, my favorite show, The Wire, where Lester Freeman says that if you follow the drugs, you get drug dealers and drug addicts. If you follow the money, you don't know where the fuck you're going. And this is the case. Like we only follow the money that went through the bank, and we end up in all the stories of the world's assholes. And that's why this job is very interesting.
Oh, yeah. You couldn't meet someone who projects more romanticization onto the work that you're doing, you and your colleagues. It's
also very, very boring many times, because it's like months and months and months going through documents that you find nothing. Yeah. And then you find something in the end.
And that paper trail link between Yanukovych and Paul Manafort, you discovered that, you mentioned before, your Ukrainian colleagues in Kiev. Was it the paper that was tossed into the water Was it from that evidence that you discovered this link?
So there's the story of the paper in the waters is so interesting today because it's exactly what you see in Syria at this very moment. And it reminds the picture that I see from Syria now and the colleagues that I have on the ground in Syria now that are trying to gather all these documents. You know, they're inside Assad's house at this very moment, taking pictures of all the documents there. And this is exactly what happened in Ukraine 2014 when Viktor Yanukovych fled from his presidential palace in Meshihiria, trying to throw away evidence of mass corruption into the lake before taking the helicopter to Moscow. And my dear colleagues of OCCRP and Ukraine, they went there, fished up the documents. They were drying them in the sauna where Putin used to be, and day by day finding these amazing stories of how money was stolen from hospitals and schools in Ukraine and puts in the pockets of, for example, Paul Manafort. So as always with money laundering, there's like you often have like a piece of the puzzle from very different directions. And I think the lake with the papers in Ukraine was the start of a lot of trails leading to how can we connect the schemes of Yanukovych. And that's when they found the Black Ledger, it was called, which was the black payments to Manafort. And so everybody's starting to like, okay, let's follow the money on Manafort. And at that time, American investigators had already started a FBI investigation into possible collusion with Russia to win the election for Donald Trump, 2016. So Manafort was arrested in 2017. This was 2 years before our program in Swedbank. And FBI concluded that, you know, Yanukovych worked for Putin in Ukraine through Russian oligarchs. He worked together with military intelligence agents and to influence Ukraine in a Putin-friendly direction. And he was paid with black money from Yanukovych that went through Cyprus and a lot of companies in Cyprus that went to the US to buy like ostrich vests and python snake jackets and Hampton real estate, Manhattan real estate. So they did a money laundering investigation into him. Okay, you haven't taxed on this money. So the Americans investigated US and Cyprus connections. So we have that part of the puzzle. And then we could buy, because we knew with the Ukrainian colleagues that Vega Holdings, this company, was a part of Yanukovych's money laundering machine. Okay, so we have the American here, we have the Ukraine here, and then we need the intermediary, which is a bank. And the reason why we looked into it was because we thought that we knew that Swedbank had been in Ukraine and in Baltics, and there was traces going into Swedbank. So we started to look, okay, can we connect all these companies of Manafort that the Americans have in their investigation with the Ukrainian investigation companies like Vega Holdings, and is there a link in between? And I think it was Joachim that was sitting on a train going through all these documents, finding the connections, and we were like, shit, we have a direct link where we can see the money flow going from Vega to the Cyprus accounts, companies of Manafort going into the US. So all of a sudden we had this amazing story, but we really needed 3 super good sources to pull it together. A lake of secret documents in Ukraine, one of the biggest FBI investigations into money laundering of modern time, and a super big leak of transactions from Swedbank. That was what was needed for this story to be told. And I mean, this is the first time in history where we're actually been able to have that kind of material. Because earlier, it was before Panama Papers and everything, it was inaccessible.
Right. You know, you need those 3 things to work in your favor, plus an exceptional amount of hard work and commitment, a salary that's not giving any immediate returns, like it's a long-term story, to discover this. So if you think about like an iceberg metaphor, and maybe you've revealed what is on top, just how deep and how large do you suspect it goes down?
I think we're understanding more and more how deep and like how extremely damaging it has been. We see this more and more all the time, because like the reason why we were able to uncover this was not because all of a sudden the American state became super interested in money laundering, or it was because of, just as much as, the UK state took the keys from the oligarchs when Russia invaded Ukraine. What was needed for the Americans to look at Paul Manafort in a real, he had been in the US doing corrupt deals for 30 years, helping African dictators to, wash their reputation in Washington. What was needed for FBI to really look at the money flow of Manafort was the biggest intervention from a foreign actor into the American election ever in American history. Like, Russia influenced and helped Trump win. That is stated. That is, it's a fact. And to investigate that, Robert Mueller, the whole investigation there, that was put together because it was a threat against American democracy. And that's when they put together a investigation into the money of Paul Manafort. Yeah. The U.S. election would have been, not affected by this money. They wouldn't have done anything. So the exceptional state of crisis that is needed to start a process of looking into this iceberg is what really makes you understand how much has been going on without us knowing, and how deeply intertwined our legal economy is into the illegal economy. And I think that is I have a very big respect for politicians that says, like, this is very hard to do anything about. Because, okay, if we do this in the long term, which is good, what happens to our pension funds in the short term? What happens to our, relations with foreign relations with all these countries that were, selling weapons to, or selling, for Sweden examples, we're a super export-based economy. Like, if we would really confront all these issues that we're finding in the money laundering.
Like, just how devastating would it be?
Yeah, I think and that is the whole point with this influence operation, that the idea that Russia have had is if we infiltrate the Western financial system and intertwine our interests with theirs, it will be, when they realized that they're fucked, there won't be almost any way of, unfuck it.
Right.
And that is the brilliant idea of that KGB formulated even during the Cold War, that money can be used in much better ways.
Not just to buy tacky clothing.
No, and much more effective than building more nuclear bomb or atomic bomb or putting another ship in the Mediterranean warship. It's like, let's buy a football team.
Yeah.
Everybody thought that Roman Abramovich bought Chelsea because he fell in love with football during a game between Real Madrid and Manchester United, where I think Ronaldo scored a hat-trick. That is the official story. The Russian real story is that Putin and his gang realized that how are we going to gain power in the world and in the UK? What is the way of gaining power and status in the UK? What is the love that combines the British people?
Own a football team, buy the best players in the world, and make everyone
So he became the Roman Empire. He became the It was an amazing whitewash of the reputation of the Russian oligarchs in the UK. And it was a plan for infiltration that it started with the Chelsea investment, and it ended with Russia having the World Cup in 2018, and the FIFA chief was standing there saying, this is amazing, Russia is amazing, everything is amazing. And it was an idea of like, okay, this is a great way of gaining influence. And there's so much that goes on that we don't understand until way too late.
Yeah. And do you suspect what you uncovered could barely just be like a flake of snow on this massive iceberg?
I think that is the amazing effect that the Panama Papers had, and then we have had Pandora Papers, Paradise Papers, Swiss leaks, all these kind of financial leaks. And since it's been so huge, like millions and millions of documents, we have actually been able to uncover a big chunk of the iceberg. Because, normally it would be like, okay, we can uncover that one oligarch have laundered money through this law firm in Panama, and that's a scandal, and that's like the top of the iceberg, or part of the iceberg, or like a part of snow that melted from the iceberg. But through Panama Papers, 10 million documents, we could actually show like, oh, this is 25% of the iceberg, because we can actually count, how much money there is and how much money that goes through. So I think that we know a lot and we understand how big it is, and we could actually calculate some of the sums. So in Swedbank, for example, there's now calculations that there was toxic flows of Russian money going through the bank in the value of I have to say this correct. So it's $300 billion. So around 3,000 Swedish billion krona. And that's why it's called the biggest money laundering scheme that we've seen so far in the history of the world, that it's those enormous amounts. And that's just one bank.
One bank which is known as the most Swedish of all banks. A bank that's meant to be one of the good guys.
Yeah.
So you look at one like, I don't know, Barclays or HSBC or Lloyds, if you could dig into what they were doing.
But I think that's also the case with Swedbank, that it's like it was such a perfect way of flushing money through the system because it was seen as a quality stamp. Like if you go to Credit Suisse, there is 100 years history of corrupt money going through Switzerland, but go through a Swedish bank, the biggest bank in the Baltics, and Baltics being the engine of Russian money laundering for the last 20 years. Because just to explain, like it was a perfect scheme that all of a sudden the Baltics were part of the European Union, and at the same time they were former Soviet corrupt societies. By putting the money from Russia to the Baltics into the West through a Swedish bank that had a stamp on like, oh, Sweden approved money, that was a great way of not raising suspicion.
You made a point earlier about the intertwined between the legal and illegal society. I think Bradley Hope has this one line that surmises it so perfectly, like how it could be the case that the legal and the illegal are so intertwined. You could be sitting in an office building. It could very well be this one, but it could be more likely in London. It's got 40 floors, it's got hundreds of office spaces. And you go in there every day and, you work at a marketing firm and it's got nothing to do with this entire world whatsoever. But the lease that you're paying to is inadvertently income through a series of offshore shell companies to Yanukovych, to one of Putin's oligarchs, to potentially a Chinese oligarch or a Mexican cartel that's totally diversified its insane amounts of profits. And then through no ill will of your own, you just happen to be a part of this system.
I met Bradley last week actually in London, and he does really amazing work in that sense of trying to uncover the undermoney system. And I met Stephanie Baker as well, with that been part of the podcast, right?
Yep, they've both been guests.
Oh yeah, they're both guests. With how the sanctions are working, amazing work she's done. And I think what they have shown in their reporting is really how this idea that we can change the system with our choice of consumption is extremely naive. And that's why I have a problem with saving the world through buying the right stuff. Even I have a problem with the idea that don't buy drugs because you're financing the crime violence on the street. It's true. I'm not saying you should buy drugs, but it's a perspective of that the legal and the illegal economy are separated. And as you say, it is possible, it's even plausible that you are investing more money in the organized crime economy buying a penthouse than buying cocaine. And that is why we have such a challenge as a society, because it's not something that you can just, let's decide to, not buy any more drugs and we won't have an organized crime anymore. It is, of course, it will have a big effect if that would be the case, but it's but Hells Angels, the biggest organized crime entity in Sweden, and maybe I would say they are totally intertwined in the legal economy. They have real estate companies. They have companies that are everywhere in the white economy.
Diversified portfolio.
Yeah.
Hidden through shell companies.
And they are entrepreneurs. And I think that that's why it's much more interesting to talk about structures, AML programs, like anti-money laundering for a bank, than it is about don't support Chelsea because you're giving Roman Abramovich money. And what is more damaging, to go to a Chelsea game or to have all your money at Swedbank without pushing for them to have better systems for anti-money laundering?
You keep getting back to this sort of broader underlying problem of it damaging society. Is there one or two specific examples that you keep referring to in the back of your mind that exemplify how this huge amount of money laundering is genuinely damaging society?
I think since I'm going to London a lot on investigations, and I love going there, and I love English football, and I was there with my kids the other week watching Manchester United, and it's such a amazing country, and the Brexit tragedy is really horrifying in the sense of, like, when you talk to British people now, both Brexiteers and pro-Europe, they're like, they don't even understand what happened. Nobody understands. Nobody really can say what did we want to do here? What was the idea? What has changed? More than just Europe is much more divided and shattered. And undoubtedly, there was a big foreign influence on the Brexit campaign from Russia as a divide and conquer modus operandi with, just with this money, because you couldn't be like, okay, Russia is sending $2 billion to the Brexit campaign. You had to have money laundered to be able to contribute so much money. And I think it's not because I love the European Union or pro or against EU. It's just about, the idea of working together in this globalized world through the European Union. And if people want to leave the European Union, that is, of course, good if the people want to do that genuinely. But if they want to do that because influence campaigns from foreign powers and money from foreign powers, then it's a huge issue, I think. But also Donald Trump is like, we could have a totally different world if he was not elected. And it's not me saying it, but very insightful people in the US, that Donald Trump wouldn't have been able to get elected the first time if not for Russia. And probably now, last time he did it pretty much by himself. But to go through that first, winning those very important key states with the help from Russian disinformation and social media campaigns and hacking, the same states that Paul Manafort at the Havana Club in New York gave information to a military intelligence officer from Russia during the campaign, that Russian intelligence then pinpointed those specific states. It wouldn't have been possible, and we see the enormous damage that it has had on society, and it's
sad. Are you kind of, do you lament it, or do you feel a little bit defeated sometimes having to come up against this, or is it still thrilling and enthralling that uncovering this sort of stuff is a part of your life and your work?
I don't feel depressed that often about the world. I almost can't handle to see the pictures from Gaza and stuff like that, the videos there. So I don't work with war that much and stuff like that. That makes me really feeling powerless. But I think when it comes to this financial investigations, it is a very fun adventure, because it is we live in totally different worlds. Me and the people flying on private jets all over the world, having Titanic-sized super yachts. But in this context, they are very scared of what we're doing. And it is fun to have the power to have that kind of influence. And it's a great responsibility, of course, but it's also very exciting to see this is changing the world.
Yeah. And it's genuinely consequential. Your work and your colleagues' work has really upended a lot of, not lives necessarily, maybe in one specific case, but dramatically altered a lot of projects and paths that people, quite devastating to a lot of plans in a lot of ways. So really consequential.
Yeah, and I think what makes me depressed maybe is the fact that the trust of media is going down. And as long as we have, the people believe that our work is important, I think there is a great chance of change. But, the feeling that, like, all journalists are just, liars, and this is the information, there's only opinions and no facts and everything, that is really scary but it's, no, we can feel the importance of our work, and we can feel that we have changed history by these investigations, and that we are playing a very important role as kind of watchdogs of these times, because the national authorities are so weak in combating these issues. So the need for this kind of work is very needed.
Yeah. Do you feel that falling status in journalism here in Sweden as well? Or is that just observations you make from the US and sort of their media landscape?
I mean, it's apparent that we have the same trends here, but that what is so interesting with Sweden is that we still have a very high level of trust to public service, for example, journalism. Like, I think it's 70% of the Swedish population that says that they have a good trust or good faith in what we do. And I'm not sure but I think that's unique in the world. And I think it's, as long as you have that, you have a functioning democracy. When you go to the US and you see that, in some of the states which Trump won now, like Pennsylvania, for example, I think it was the case, there is no like real good local media left. And you see how like Elon Musk and those guys have put in disinformation campaigns to those specific areas, and then you go and watch like CNN and Fox hitting each other in the head. I'm not sure if you could call that a functioning democracy. Like, no, but the US, with the the low percentage of participation in the election, the disinformation, is that a functioning democracy? I think it's questionable. There was one journalist that called it a society ran by the American oligarchs now, and I think it's really interesting to see the Musk-Trump alliance, which is that is quite kind of like more like Russia than it's in some terms like Sweden.
Yeah, if you think about it, this guy Elon has a space company, an electric vehicles company, many other companies as well. But now that same company owner is in charge of deregulating their country. It's such a brazen conflict of interest that I just don't feel like is acknowledged more. You have to assume bad intentions from Musk, like that he would use it to benefit himself. The jury's out on whether that will be the case, but it's still a giant conflict of interest, kind of like an inescapably bad conflict of interest.
Yeah, and I think it was Bradley Hope that said this the other day. Like, we've had all American oligarchs before, or billionaires having a lot of influence, but it's been in the shadows.
And now it's just out in the open.
Now it's openly on the family photos of the White House. And I guess in some ways it's good because we can address the problem, but I don't think it's ever been this tight. Like, who is even running the country? Is it like, or now, but when they get installed? I think the only hope in that sense is that they're both narcissists that won't be able to
work together
in the long run. There was a report from Mar-a-Lago already that says that, like, Donald was like, when is Elon going to leave? He's hanging around here all the time. Like, they're probably going to end up fighting each other. But it's a really sad state of affairs that this is like Twitter, that was such an amazing voice for diversity. And, you could go, when I worked in the Congo, there was amazing. You could like look at local politics of a southern district in Congo and go on Twitter, and you can follow by translating. I don't speak French, but translating right away, you can follow like, okay, what's the discussion here?
Cool. That doesn't exist really anymore.
It does, but I mean, if it was a symbol of an amazing revolution of different voices. Now it is like the algorithms makes, when you go into X, it's like the top of everything. You have Elon Musk's crazy night rambling, and there is like just right-wing explosive disinformation all over, and it is we can like in I think it was 2011 that a colleague of mine won the Stora Journalistpriset, which is the Pulsar of Sweden, the big journalism prize for, and there's a category which we won actually a couple of weeks ago, which is like
congratulations, man.
innovative journalism. And 2011, that prize went to, I think in that year, to a journalist called King Asandén that was reporting from Iran on Twitter. Like, and everybody was like, this is amazing. You can get, like, before, when you were a journalist and you went to Iran, you had a fixer, and you asked the fixer, like, can you, is there anybody we can interview about this topic? And the fixer has his network, and you will get all the same people, and you will be, like, dependent on that structure. And all of a sudden you could go to Iran and be like, write to people directly, like, okay, can I interview you? You wrote this. And now that is up in the air.
Let's bring you back, because we haven't mentioned honey trap yet. So you said that 5 years after the big Swedbank story, maybe you're trying to write a book about it to keep it alive, because this might be this big. But then in the investigation, it turns from a money story into a sex story. And Kompromat is really at the core of that. And it's funny how simple and base it is in a way. I would have thought that, Kompromat today would come from data hacking or some type of deep fake, but it's just good old fashioned honey traps, guys thinking with their dicks and being filmed.
Yes, I think it's what is really makes the Russian security and intelligence services be in one way, the best in the world, is that they have such a deep insight into human psychology and the vulnerabilities of people, and not believing in their best sides, but believing in the worst sides. And I think the idea of Kompromat is that as long as there is secrets, there is power and coercion, and you can really use, exactly as 100 years ago, there is the shame of getting your secrets exposed is the worst thing that can happen to human beings. So, and there is still a lot of Western businessmen, mostly men, that, when they drink their first GT on the plane, on their business trip, their moral compass is switching from, Swedish feminism to, in this case, Russian chauvinism, male chauvinism. And of course, that doesn't mean that Sweden is better than Russia. It just means that, we are always adapting to, like, in Sweden, this is what functions. And then you're changing the morals when you come to another society, and all of a sudden you go to this Hotel Metropole, which our guy in the book does, goes to the bar, see a Russian fancy lady, falls in love with her, pays her for sex, and all of a sudden, without realizing it, is intertwined in this web with the Russian security service. And why make it complicated when it's easy? It's like, do you want your kids to see a picture with you and a Russian prostitute? Right. No. Okay.
Doing something a little bit embarrassing with a mask on or something like this. A lot of it was intentionally embarrassing, right? It's not two people having missionary. Like, these Russian agents are intentionally getting them to do very embarrassing stuff.
Yeah, but I think it all depends of the context. Like, for a Swedish businessman, is to have a picture with you and a prostitute is enough to get your career devastated. In Russia, going to a prostitute is not as shameful. Then you have, when you were trying to have Kompromat on a Russian politician, we write about it in the book, you had to have him taking cocaine, being with two women that had, like, balls in their mouth, or, like, leather balls, and with whips and stuff, because that will be then, okay, you're sick, or you're a sick bastard, you're a pervert. So it all depends. And, like, 50 years ago, there were Kompromat against Swedish, or against many, but I guess Sweden is a good example, was if you were a diplomat and you were homosexual, security service of a foreign country could document that and punish you for that.
Yeah, just that sort of Damocles.
Now, that is not Kompromat anymore, because it's accepted in society. So if everybody say, I'm going to tell the secret that you're gay, and I'm like, okay, it won't be a problem. But if they would say, I'm going to tell the secret that you're taking drugs or gambling or being with prostitutes, that is much more damaging.
And so the Russian infiltration here via the Russian prostitutes got Kompromat against senior executives at Swedbank, which then could apply the pressure. We need you to do this. We need you to do this.
I think that the idea of Kompromat is even more intelligent than like what you would do in a movie about, honey trap. It's like the classic idea is that, okay, so we have Ryan that we want to like push the button for all our billions from Russia, and he sits in the bank. So, okay, we get him with a prostitute, and then we take the video, and then before he gets to make the decision about the money, we show him this video, and we say, if you don't push the money button, we're going to throw this out in the public. Okay. So that's the classic, and that's how a Hollywood movie would write. The Russian real-life movie is much more complex and much more interesting. It is the fact, so it's based on this, okay. We have thousands of Western businessmen coming to Moscow every year. Now we're talking about 2005, when this meeting takes place that we're starting the book with. So the Russian idea was, let's gather kompromat on all of these guys that goes to Russian prostitutes. And one can say, like, okay, but why would you gather kompromat on a Swedish mid-level executive at a bank that we don't know how we're going to use it? Yeah. And then I said, no. We gather as much as we can. Just like, in DDR or whatever, we should have ears everywhere. And we put them in the files and we freeze it down. And one day, 1 out of 100, we might have a very good use of this. So this Swedbank executive that we call Peter in the book, he went to a prostitute in Moscow in 2005. He took her back to Sweden, married her, and it was a secret for everybody that she was a prostitute, of course. And all of a sudden, he became head of large corporation institution accounts at Swedbank, the third most important executive at the whole bank. This is the department where the big Russian money flow is going through. So the question is, of course, the idea that there was a voice in the book that says this, that like kompromat is most effective when it's not exposed. So I think, even though we don't exactly know what have been going on in this specific case, I think that, first of all, they had a person on the inside living together with the top executive branch of Swedbank. So that's a direct line into the Swedbank management that gave them a lot of information, of course. But the fact that this executive knew that he did a lot of bad stuff in Russia and that there was probably somebody knowing about this, that is much more effective of him making the right decision for Russia than having to pressure him, with the videos and the pictures. So the idea is, and this is much more clear when it comes to Donald Trump, for example. Like, we know that the Russians have kompromat on Donald Trump. We don't know what it is. Donald Trump probably doesn't know what it is. But he knows that they've been gathering intelligence about him for over 20 years. So when he's going to make a decision, he's going to think, how is this going to affect Russia? And how can this be bad for me in terms of what they know? So without even the Russians having to say anything, he will, as we've seen with Trump, he will not make a single decision that goes against like the Russian agenda without them having even to mention that they have a sex tape on him for all of his visits to Moscow. So that is the great idea of it, that you should just create a notion inside the person that is responsible that if you don't do the right thing here, there's a big danger of you being exposed. So don't take the risk.
Yeah. You know about the sword of Damocles? Basically, the sword of Damocles is some old story from Rome where it's just this emperor was in a constant state of fragility, because this proverbial sword hung over his head the entire time.
Yeah.
And therefore, he becomes a puppet to whoever is holding the sword. But I love the way that you frame it, that it's not like it is in the Russian movie where you identify a person, not Russian Hollywood movie. You identify the person, you specifically target them out for the kompromat, and then you ask them to do exactly what you want them to do, so they go ahead and do it. Instead, it sounds like there's some Russian vault of hundreds of thousands of maybe different people, just on the, off chance that 1 in 100 becomes powerful one day. And
that's how the KGB functioned. They had 1 million people working for them, gathering information, mostly about their own citizens, in files. That could be used for pressure, but mostly for information. And
So do you suspect then that whether it's yourself or some of your colleagues have had these attempts made on you?
These kind of honey trap attempts. I think like that is another part of making this story a little more complex, because I think also the Russian prostitutes, for example, they were not, some of them were trained at schools for being, you know, in Swedish you say svalor.
Yeah.
What's it?
Like a vixen. You're trained in...
Yeah, so there is like a, you know, the KGB education of being a honey trap woman.
Yeah, there was a movie about it called Red Sparrow.
So that's it called, the sparrows. And they learn how to seduce men and use it, etc. But then you have the whole big gray sector of like Russian semi-prostitutes that goes to be with all these men that comes to Russia. And they're not like hired by, they're not even paid maybe by but they're informants. So the Russian security service, they know like all the prostitutes at Hotel Metropole, which is this famous place where they met in the book. So they will just, you know, follow them, and then at the right time being like, okay, so you met this guy, meet him again, and just tell us where he's going to be next or whatever. So it's a great way, effective system of gathering information without having to have all the people like hired or educated. It's just going to happen. So I don't even think that the woman in this case was like pinpointing Swedbank at that time, because at that time Swedbank was, you know, it was one of many banks, but it became more important over time. That's
even before they had their Baltic state branches.
It was right at around the time when they were expanding into Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltics. So, but I think, you know, this whole really book idea started with me getting a phone call from the counter-espionage department at the Swedish security police from a source saying that, okay, so we have been following some Russian spies and their activities in Stockholm, and we have seen that one of the addresses that they have surveilled is your home. And since I'm an investigative journalist and like, you know, mentally ill in that sense, I was very curious instead of scared. But also I know that the Russian security service, they don't kill foreign journalists. Like it's very, very rare. They think logical. Why would they don't want to hurt me. They want information. So he was scared, of course, that I had my kids and my wife there and everything, but mostly I was curious, like, why is Russian spies interested in my work? And this was just right after the Swedbank published, when we published the first story about Swedbank. And I started to try to answer the question, why? And that's what led me to this whole book project, because it was a question of like, okay, so I have more seen like, okay, there are three entities in Russia, the security service, FSB, the Kremlin with Putin, and oligarchs. They work together sometimes, but they're three different, you know, sections of Russian society. But in the end, with the book, we understood that this is really one entity working together with money laundering as one tool for the state. And that's why it was so important for FSB to be infiltrating and interesting in Swedbank. And that's because, as I said in the beginning, the weapon of money laundering is much more effective than weapons of mass destruction, because it is used every day to dismantle the Western system from the inside. Really, this was kind of the push into this whole story, where then kompromat and sex and extortion or espionage all comes into the case of like, okay, how should we, as effectively as possible, move all this money from Russia into the West to use it for different purposes later on, for our interests? And what we know now is that the Russian oligarchs, they don't work independently at all. They work for Putin. And that is a whole game changer, because we thought, like Roman Abramovich, he said, like, no, I'm in London, I want to be a Western businessman, I don't have anything to do with Putin, and I'm going to sue everybody that connects with me, Putin. And he did. And then when the war in Ukraine started in 2022, and there was peace negotiations in like Istanbul, who is Putin sending as his main negotiator, as, you know, the one he trusts the most? Yeah. Roman Abramovich. So the war has really exposed this whole system of the dogs of Putin that was seen as kind of these, oh, they want to be Western, like, or whatever.
You can only imagine the kompromat that many of these oligarchs have hanging over their heads as well, despite how careful they might try to be. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a honey trap kompromat. It could be series of other very devastating things that they've done.
Yeah, and I think that there's like the famous case of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, that was kind of trying some kind of coup, marching against Moscow. Why was he not killed immediately when the coup was, or the attempt was stopped? Like, and I talked to a source in France with insights in the intelligence system there, and they said, well, he was murdered a couple of months afterwards, or they shot down his plane. Because first they needed to understand where all his money was. Because they knew some of the money flows, but he also had a lot of hidden ones, like diamonds and gold in Africa from all the Simons there. So all the oligarchs know that they are, whenever they go against the Kremlin, they can fall out of the window. Their kids can fall out of the window, but also a lot of people will try to get to their money. And their money is not theirs. It's Putin's money.
It's so wild.
If you follow the system and you are reliable, then you can live freely.
So the books, you've got an English publisher now for an English translation?
That's one of the reasons why I was in London last week. So we're having talks with English publishers, but it's not yet a deal. It's sold to the Baltics, and it's going to come out next year in the Baltics, and hopefully in some other big languages.
It's been a bestseller in Sweden already.
Yes, it's gone very well in Sweden, and it is we tried to write a compelling spy story, but at the same time relied on facts, and it's been working in the sense of people have been like, wow, this was something that we could never imagine, really.
Yeah. And so as someone who's been propelled, especially in the Swedish media landscape, into the spotlight, you won the Stora Journalistpriset, and you've got this best-selling book. This is a final question, which I try to ask every guest, but specifically for you, what type of serendipity has come into your life because of your larger profile now as not only a total expert on money laundering, someone who has uncovered the biggest case ever in Swedish history of money laundering, but as well as one of the most prominent journalists? Are you getting more tips into your inbox? Are you getting...
What does the word serendipity means, really?
Yeah, serendipity, it's a beautiful word. It means the random upside from a chance encounter.
Oh, okay.
So, for instance, you cross the street today, you buy a coffee, and they go, my husband works for this bank, and he's not very happy there, and I'm sure you could talk to him. Like, that would be a serendipitous encounter.
Okay, I get it. Yeah. No, I think that, winning prizes and being successful can be make your soul hollow, in many ways. And
that's not what we're supposed to hear.
And I've seen, when you work with television, you see that a lot of people change, and I think it's not a way of being arrogant and saying, but it's really, it's hard for human beings to be, and I'm not at all, people don't recognize me on the street, so I'm not very seldom have that problem. But now the Lucia is coming. That's a good way of, that's a good end.
Exactly. We just fade to black as this comes on.
So the shallowness is one side of it, but or the whole you need more confirmation to your soul. But I think what really these success is giving us is the capital of time. We can work even longer on investigations. Right. We can have...
Your employer will allow you to take a bigger risk.
So for every prize, there's I can do weird stuff for another year that may fail. And nobody will really say, why are we paying you to sit here and do this weird stuff? So it gives us capital to do more. And that is, of course, a privilege in this world of media where everybody needs to work faster. I'm actually working slower and slower for every month.
And that's such a great point. I'm so happy you said that, because that is contrary.
Slow journalism is my... I have a thing I call the Skalman method. I don't know if you followed Bamse. You know Bamse? Well, this is this cartoon in Swedish where he's like a bear and he has when he eats honey, he becomes the strongest man on earth. And he has a what's it called? A sköldpadda, a turtle, as one of his partners. And this turtle is called Skalman. And he's always very, very slow. And he has this clock that when it rings, it's the food and sleep clock. Even though they're out on a dangerous assignment, if the food and sleep clock rings, Skalman just goes into his like turtle and eats and sleep, and it doesn't matter where they are. And it's like, this is the Skalman method, the turtle method that I have. Is like, we work slow, nobody can rush us, even though some say like, we need to publish now, it's a crisis. We'd be like, no, 3 months more.
Yeah.
Our clock is.
But it's so funny because in a shifting media landscape where the traditional business model for all types of publications in journalism is just dead, it's even beyond dying, and we've sort of covered that, and I need to tell you about that. But thankfully with SVT or SR, or I'm not sure, who was your publisher, SVT? Yeah. So sorry, your employer. So because of the state media aspect of it, they can take that bigger risk. You know, and even if Axel only publishes one thing per year, it's still a decent enough return on our investment. But that risk for a profit-seeking media company is just so much harder. And so because of the fractured attention where people are actually consuming things. You know, I've interviewed a bunch of guys before who, like John Lee Anderson, for instance, you know, one of the goats of magazine writing for the New Yorker. And he still has that. He can publish 2 things a year and he gets a decent salary per month from the New Yorker anyway. Like, it's a very romantic idea of journalism, but I think one which is so rare that people get to actually pursue. So
if you do this work fast, you will burn out in so fast. You will be, it's, you know, like, I have a hidden identity. You have, sometimes there's death threats. You have like when people ask, I was asked the question when we won this prize the other week, like, how do you do this? What is the key to getting nominated to prizes? And I was like, you have to get a good shrink. Like, that is the key to, you have to survive this kind of stuff. And if you don't, like, it's very damaging for a lot of reason for your personal life to do this stuff. And you really need to be able to do this as a freelancer. It would be impossible. So hail public service.
Nice. Axel, as Lucia fades into the background, I think this is a good time to end it.
Yes.
Honey Trap isn't available in English yet, but I'll certainly make my audience aware of it as soon as it is.
Yeah, and they can email me if they want to read it in AI translated.
Yeah, totally.
We're trying to spread the word, and hopefully it will be both international television and international book. Negotiations are on its way.
Yeah, so you've got interest from some type of media adaptation, TV adaptation so far?
Yeah, that's one of the
incredible.
things we work with.
Well, mate, thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Thank you.